Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the Innovation Speaker Series. The Speaker Series is designed to introduce students, faculty, and staff to innovation, commercialization, and tech transfer. I'm Nina Patrick, the Innovation Lead at the Champs-Élysées Foundation, and today I'm joined by Tyler Golato, the co-founder and CSO of Molecule. Molecule builds specialized communities called BioDAOs for physicians, scientists, and patients to share decision-making and governance in specific therapeutic areas. And they've introduced two novel biopharma funding mechanisms, an IP-NFT and IP tokens for public governance of scientific research. And they've already funded millions in areas like longevity, synbio, psychedelics, and more. So thank you, Tyler, for joining me today. And if you want to kick us off by telling us about your background and how that led you to found Molecule.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nina. I really appreciate it. And this is a really cool series, so it's an honor to be a guest. So I started out my career wanting to be a physician. I was kind of your archetypal pre-med student, really strong interest in biochemistry. And from an early age, I have a history of cancer in my family. I was really interested in oncology. And I spent a lot of time early in my career just spending time in clinical settings, kind of observing medicine as a practice. And one of the things that you realize as you come up against kind of the frontier of oncology is that it's a kind of applied practice. You have kind of standardization of care, and within any of the particular cancers that one might have an interest in specializing in, you kind of have a treatment in a known range of outcomes. The frontier is really happening in research, not so much in medicine. And I kind of realized the more and more time that I spent with physicians that, particularly in intractable cancers, so pancreatic cancer, glioblastoma, where I had a strong interest, it seemed like mostly they were fighting a losing battle. Kind of successes were measured in months. And so increasingly, I became interested in research and really particularly drug development. I spent a couple of years in a laboratory at Columbia University focused on experimental therapeutics, a translational laboratory that was working on second and third line therapies for pancreatic cancer, glioblastoma, and neuroendocrine tumors. So again, very intractable cancers and typically treating mostly like stage 4 metastatic cancer in these patients. So it was an interesting lab because basically you were working very quickly in this kind of bench to bedside paradigm, developing typically the therapies that we were developing. We're looking at overcoming mechanisms of chemotherapeutic resistance, and then we would somewhat rapidly translate these to like an experimental clinical population. And while I was there, one of the things that really struck me was that, and this was kind of before Obamacare. So you would have patients that would come to the clinic in Washington Heights in New York City. That there was like a large Dominican population there that's kind of chronically underinsured and has a particularly high incidence of pancreatic cancer. And they would come to the clinic, and if they didn't meet the inclusion criteria for these clinical trials, and they also didn't have health insurance, they would just be turfed away from the hospital. You don't have to treat, at the time, you didn't have to treat someone with cancer. It's not an acute condition. And this was really surprising to me, kind of going bright-eyed and bushy-tailed into medicine, just seeing some of the pitfalls of the system and where people fall through the cracks. And the PI that I was working with at the time was really spending a lot of his effort, instead of looking at, what is the absolute frontier of the field, which at the time were things like didn't really work, but like tyrosine kinase inhibitors and some of the things that were being tested in cancer at the time as potential silver bullets. He was instead looking at like novel combinations of chemotherapeutic drugs that were off patent, really trying to create very cheap and affordable medicines that almost anyone would be able to afford, even if they didn't have healthcare. And I found this to be quite a profound thing, like at a medical center that's really well equipped to do medicine in a very wealthy city, in a very wealthy country, that someone who had spent he was the chair of the department probably 45 years plus in a research practice and an applied medical practice was not necessarily thinking about what is the most innovative scientific thing I could be doing, but rather looking at how could they just make sure that they had the ability to treat patients. And so this was like quite a wake-up call quite early, just realizing that like the structure of incentives as it exists in drug development in the context of the US healthcare system wasn't always necessarily dictated by what is an effective cure, what is an effective treatment. There were a lot of kind of other mechanisms at play that made delivery of care very difficult. Anyway, long story short, became more interested in preventative medicine, which is kind of a weird thing because it doesn't really exist as a discipline, but the closest thing I found that was kind of at least tangential to my interests or adjacent to my interest in oncology was biogerontology, the science of aging. I moved to the National Institutes of Health at the National Institute on Aging in the laboratory of molecular gerontology with Wilhelm Bohr, and was working mostly on DNA damage and repair, oxidative stress, the underlying mechanisms of aging, but with really an interest in trying to understand if there were ways to better understand processes like DNA repair in order to potentially prevent many of these age-related diseases that are kind of intrinsically linked to it. NIH was really interesting because in the intramural research laboratories there, you have this funding mechanism, or certainly you have a funding paradigm where, like, if you work in these labs, you have a budget, it's reviewed every 4 years, it's not really publish or perish, you're not competing for money, you have a lot of autonomy. So it was actually very different than to how academia worked in the traditional sense. And I felt like I glimpsed into like how science could work given a lot of autonomy, a lot of budget, and a little bit less of a publish or perish mentality. And while I was there, was also working on progerias. I had a sub-fellowship that I did that was focused on health disparities, just because I had spent a lot of my career focused on like these diseases of affluence, things like cancer, things like neurodegeneration, things that in many cases affect elderly people or people who have kind of the privilege of being able to age in some sense. And I had an opportunity to do something very different. I became interested in HIV, and also there's just kind of medicine as a practice in other parts of the world. And I ended up moving to South Africa to work on HIV vaccine development for a period of time on a trial that was kind of a spin out from a Thai trial that had occurred some years before with some level of efficacy, but still not enough to get an approval. Was there for a couple of years, totally rabbit holed into like more the community work side of things, realized that like HIV in sub-Saharan Africa wasn't necessarily a problem for medicine to solve alone, but also was more linked to kind of sociological, anthropological problems. And at this time, had seen a lot of different aspects of research, of medicine, applied practice, research practices, and just realized that like I couldn't necessarily find one area where I felt like I would have a huge amount of leverage from a career perspective. And I really wanted to understand a little bit more around like the macroeconomics of healthcare and looking at if there were ways to apply leverage to the entire system as a whole, purely from an incentive structure perspective. And at the time I was introduced to an economist, Paul Kohlhaas, my now co-founder at Molecule, who was actually coming from the kind of blockchain Web3 space. But very early on, this was like, he got into the space around 2013. We met around 2017. And he had written a paper actually talking about how NFTs could be utilized to change ownership dynamics around pharmaceutical intellectual property. And this is quite funny now because like, this is before there was an NFT space. Before there was an NFT art space. This is like very early days of Web3. I think the only use case at the time was CryptoKitties, which was like the kind of introduction of this as a primitive. And he was looking at how you could take these technologies that were emerging at the time around tokenization and governance and potentially create a paradigm where you could bring together patients, bring together researchers, and turn ownership and intellectual property into kind of an agile incentive to bring people together and enable them to collaborate in this very early kind of ideation phase. He had just wrote a paper on it. And we got talking, and I was really captivated by this idea. Actually very skeptical of the technology at the time. I think many people still are. I still am actually to a large degree, but I think there's some amazing use cases. But I was really excited about this idea that like, the kind of core thesis that he was working on that really captivated my attention was, what would the world look like if the primary owners and governors of a piece of intellectual property around a therapeutic were patients themselves and researchers themselves? So what would it look like if instead of a pharmaceutical company owning the method of production for insulin, the patent for it, it was owned by diabetic advocacy organizations? How might they price it? How might they guarantee access? And what if you could kind of create a more modular drug development system where you could very easily incentivize people through ownership and intellectual property in a kind of digitally native way? And he was just tossing this around as an idea. I more or less dropped everything that I was doing, and we started, very naively thinking about how we could change the system. We opened an office in Basel, got a little bit of seed funding, knocked on a lot of pharmaceutical companies' doors, trying to find shelf IP that we could experiment with. Learned a lot, and then I would say it was only really about 3 years ago, that maybe two and a half years ago, that things got a lot more serious when we started to find the first universities who were willing to like really take the leap and tokenize their intellectual property. And we started building the first communities really focused on this intersection of bringing together researchers, patients, enthusiasts, social impact funders, entrepreneurs, builders, in kind of one structure where they would collaborate to fund research and focus on translating it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Molecule is really leading the ecosystem here. You guys have created a lot of different BioDAOs, but for some of the people in the room that don't know what a BioDAO is and how you're forming those communities, can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so DAO stands for DAO. It's Decentralized Autonomous Organization. And from a technical perspective, it really is just an organization whose bylaws are actually written in code and governed through largely proposals that folks vote on using tokens. The kind of simplest way to think about this in a way that kind of abstracts from the technical complexity is it's simply a digitally native organization that has stakeholders all over the world, and those stakeholders operate through a digital kind of governance architecture, so through a software system, through voting. And the interesting thing about these structures is that they basically have a native, what we call governance token, and they're able to basically join these organizations by contributing funding to them or by contributing work. So a researcher can join by contributing expertise, by doing due diligence for the organization, by writing articles. Funders can join by just contributing funding. Patients can join by contributing time, knowledge, data, et cetera. And in exchange for those contributions, they earn a right to vote in the organization. So collectively, one's weight in the organization and the influence that you have is kind of dictated by either the funding you put in or the work that you put in. There are organizations that exist on the Ethereum blockchain. I think it's really one of the more interesting use cases for crypto. It's kind of abstracted away from the kind of financial infrastructure that a lot of people know crypto for, and instead is kind of more in this adjacent space known as like digital democracy or digital governance. But it's, a lot of people see these organizations, a lot might be an overestimate. Some people see these organizations as the future of work in an increasingly digital remote world, and the tokens that you earn for your contributions typically have secondary markets in which they're tradable as well. So people can kind of join the organization, they can sell out of the organization. It almost would be like, it's not so different from a public company in some senses, but typically, much earlier and operating in a very decentralized way. And BioDAOs, maybe just to elaborate that, are kind of a specific type of these organizations that Molecule has initially designed, BetaDAO being the first one of them, that are focused on kind of mimicking successful execution patterns in biotech, but in a decentralized way and using these kind of novel structures.
So a lot of our scientists here are neuroscientists or in cancer biology, and you mentioned BetaDAO. This is the longevity DAO. I'm an active contributor in this one, but I don't know any that are in neuroscience yet. You're probably more familiar with this. So can you tell me about any maybe new DAOs?
There's two new ones in the neurosciences that are really interesting. One is called Synapse DAO that is it was founded by a guy called Simona, and I'm going to butcher his last name. I'm actually going to super quickly look this up so I get it right and do him justice.
No problem.
It is, let me see here. So anyway, Simona Fantaccini. He was the former CSO at Novartis Swiss, and he's also a neuroscientist and a medical doctor, and he's building a collective called Synapse DAO, actually with a few other folks that were previously. One person was the head of growth for Novartis US, so quite a few pharma folks, which is quite an interesting thing because this is I would say, a relatively new development in the DAO space. And he's particularly focused on, I would say, neurology and the neurosciences as a whole. And then there's another one called Cerebrum DAO, which is focused more purely on Alzheimer's and brain aging, and I suppose some other neurodegenerative conditions as well. We're actually incubating both of these DAOs in our next BioXYZ cohort. And for those of you that don't know, BioXYZ is kind of a BioDAO accelerator similar to YC, but focused on these BioDAOs. But the space is super nascent. So I would say that other than BetaDAO, which has been around for a little over 2 years now, most DAOs in the area, maybe also except HairDAO, which is also a little bit more advanced, it's one focused on hair loss, are kind of in this initial fundraising, pre-launch, maybe a funded 1 or 2 projects phase, but all still very early. Yeah, so these are both, I would say, you're akin to like a seed stage, pre-seed stage startup company. And so they're in their infancy, but bringing together really interesting cross-sectional research communities at this stage with some really interesting ideas. And also, yeah, I think with an intention to collaborate together as well.
Cool. So BioDAO, I know that we've deployed quite a bit of funding to different projects. Can you explain how that works and how it's actual fiat money? And you also recently had the really successful launch with the IP token, which was one of the, I think, the fastest fundraisers I've ever seen. So please, yeah, share that whole experience with the group and how you got there.
I'll talk about a couple of things because it's interesting. I mean, first I'll talk about how we go about finding projects to fund. Then I'll talk a little bit about like the mechanisms of how they're actually funded, both a little bit from the technical perspective, but then also maybe from the kind of point of view of a TTO or a university, just so that these things start to click a little bit. So the idea with these DAOs is that you bring together a community of academics, PhDs, postdocs, master students, and the kind of strength of these DAOs is the ability to create network effects. So you bring in a researcher who starts contributing time. They're maybe paid for this. They're incentivized through a token. They bring in their friends. They bring in projects that they know, and very quickly, DAOs can grow to communities of 500 or 1,000 researchers working all over the world, collaborating on sourcing interesting projects, things that might even be pre-TTO, ideation stage stuff. We tend to focus, they're almost exclusively on translational projects that have commercial viability, but really in the earliest stages. So from a drug development perspective, you're talking about projects that are like screening stage, target validation stage, lead optimization phase, kind of early preclinical. And so these groups basically come together. They begin sourcing projects either through active outreach where people apply. The DAO typically writes tickets that are between the $100,000 to $250,000 range, and in exchange for that, receives ownership in future intellectual property that originates from these projects. So works largely through sponsored research agreements. And the way that the DAOs fund is basically first they fundraise. So when the organization starts, it fundraises, and it does through what's called a public auction, where it will auction off some of its governance token to raise funding. It will then deploy that capital to universities. They have like a TTO squad, an IP diligence squad that basically looks at projects that are coming in. Scientists evaluate the science, lawyers evaluate the kind of IP and the commercial landscape. And then there's different squads or units, similar to how many accelerators work in the innovation space, that really work hand in hand with the research to kind of identify the promise of the project, maybe even help shape it to a large degree, because many researchers are kind of focused more on publishing papers than they are necessarily translating a drug. So really helping assess the commercial viability and guide them in a good way. And then the mechanism is actually quite simple. It's just funded typically through a sponsored research agreement. Fiat currency is off-boarded from the DAO directly to the university. So the universities actually don't deal in crypto at all. Crypto is more the governance and fundraising mechanism for the DAO, but again, they're receiving fiat. Interestingly, the universities can receive IP tokens or a share of IP through this kind of this digital method that we've developed called an IP-NFT or IPT, as you mentioned. This requires some level of onboarding, some level of trust. Some universities are comfortable with it. I would say more comfortable than others. Other universities, want to stay with the kind of processes that they know and love. But we're beginning to see some change in this as well. And then after the project's funded, typically there's a kind of internal project champion in the DAO that works directly with a researcher. They present work on a kind of quarterly basis to the community and kind of open community calls. And all of the data that they produce in the project is basically uploaded to a data repository of which the IP-NFT holder, in this case, the DAO, has a key and they can access. So what these IP-NFTs are, it just stands for intellectual property non-fungible token. The simplest way to think about it is that from a technical perspective, in the sponsored research agreement, there's a clause that enables the ownership of that agreement to be assigned to a wallet address. And for those of you that aren't Web3 native, wallets are kind of the logins, almost like an email address. You can use it to like log into these various platforms, but they also contain your governance tokens, cryptocurrency, and things like this. And so every time ownership changes hands of that IP-NFT, whether it's to another DAO or to a university, that actual real world legal contract is sublicensed to another wallet address. So there's this kind of interlinking between digital legal processes and what we call on-chain legal processes and the off-chain world. And IPTs, intellectual property tokens, so there's IP-NFTs and IPTs, are kind of a further tokenization of that intellectual property, where you basically take that agreement and you can almost think about it as cutting it up into like a million little pieces. And people can now, like a researcher could say, like, if you contribute data to my project, if you contribute the output of an assay, if you give some funding, they can very easily distribute ownership in the IP, like a millionth of a piece of ownership in the IP. So it creates kind of very, very fractional ways to incentivize. Somebody helps promote the publication, somebody does due diligence, any of these things, there's different ways that you can incentivize them. And so with Victor Korolchuk at the University of Newcastle, for those in the neuroscience space, he's working on a project on autophagy activation with kind of a core thesis that downregulation of autophagy is implicated in a lot of different neurodegenerative disorders, particularly Alzheimer's, but many others as well. He's identified a series of compounds that he believes are kind of autophagy activators. We're now kind of at this stage of doing lead optimization on several of those compounds. And he recently did, initially this was a project that was funded by BioDAO with the University of Newcastle, and then had some successful data that came out of it. And then he did a kind of further tokenization where interest in the project and governance in the project was actually auctioned off beyond the BioDAO community, so to other people who were interested in supporting it. And so these, I'm talking about a lot of things that probably a lot of unnecessary technical jargon, but at the kind of core of this, what you have is a new mechanism for researchers that are working in the very early stages in a kind of pre-company phase. So really, while things are still at the university, to be able to fundraise from folks that really have an interest in helping this asset advance from a commercial perspective. And this is quite novel in that, typically if you look at how somebody translates innovation out of academia, it might be through the creation of a biotech company. But obviously that is typically rate limited by a couple of things. One, venture capital in the biotech space tends to be interested sometimes at a bit of a later stage. And two, it's very difficult for patients or folks that maybe do not have a typical kind of accredited investor-oriented background to actually be able to support these projects in a very direct way and in a community-focused way. And this is where we see quite an interesting and powerful niche in the sense of doing community-led drug development.
So once the community owns, at least with the IPTs, how is the community engaging with the researcher, and do they get to see data updates, or do they get to have input? What does that look like so far?
Yeah, so anyone who has IPTs and also is willing to sign an NDA can get access to some level of the data. There might be some things that require maybe an additional level of validation, because for what it's worth, initially these tokens are kind of auctioned in a way where your identity isn't necessarily known. But if you want to actually get access to the data, you need to go through the process of KYC, AML, and just also signing NDAs. But anyone who participates can go through that process. Every IPT that's created is almost like its own mini organization with its own governance framework. So people who participate they have a direct line of communication to the researcher. These are all done through like Discord servers. The researcher holds typically monthly or quarterly update calls. There's folks that might have ideas for the project based on data that they see emerging. There's other researchers typically involved, and it just turns into a very collaborative type of effort. And what we see, like, an interesting example that I can give around Korolchuk's project is that, there was some data produced that folks felt it would be useful to do kind of a deeper in silico analysis with an external bioinformatician. And they created a bounty and put this up to the community and found a bioinformatician to come and do, a couple different levels of data analysis to help basically take a deeper look at the nature of some of the structures that they had identified, some of the conserved structures that I had identified in some of these molecules that were autophagy activators. And this to me is really interesting and really novel. It's basically, it's a slightly more open source way of collaborating and doing research. All of a sudden, the community identifies a need. People quickly create a bounty through a proposal. That bounty is claimed. Somebody uploads data. The community reviews that data. It's basically creating the incentive structures and kind of railway tracks that enables digital global collaboration around research to happen. And if you think about, there's so much of biology today that can happen in a kind of in silico way, particularly from a data analytics perspective. Obviously, the wet lab component is always required, but the future that I'm increasingly imagining is one where you have people all over the world collaborating via the internet, leveraging contract research organizations or almost digital laboratories even to do wet lab experiments, analyzing that data, probably assisted by things like advances in AI, and just really iterating as a community to move these things forward and kind of, moving a step beyond, not to say that it's antiquated, but, the slightly more antiquated way that we currently work in, kind of geographically constrained laboratories. We're quite sensitive about sharing data. We're concerned about being scooped. The incentives are very, perverse, I would say, in the sciences. You're not really incentivized to open up your data, to share it. And obviously, this is, money is not the only reason for this. It goes quite deep, and it's cultural as well. I would say that most of us, as a scientist myself, I can say that, there's many kind of decentralized oriented publications that I myself probably wouldn't publish in yet if I had the opportunity to publish in Nature, just because things like impact factor do matter to people. But just beginning to understand that when we look at the system, identifying where there are areas where kind of new incentive structures could possibly change behaviors is something that we've been really interested in at Molecule.
So I have a couple follow-up questions with all of that, because it's quite complex, the new funding system. And so with leveraging the community, how many people are involved with Korolchuk's project at the moment? Because you mentioned bringing in all these different groups and already being able to outsource some of this work, which I think is incredible. And then is that accelerating the timeline of development, do you feel like? And what was the timeline kind of from when that first application came in to when they got the first IP-NFT to when now you did the IP tokenization? What does that look like?
There's a great, actually, I can maybe even share it in the chat here. Let me just see, there's a great article from the University of Newcastle. They actually wrote about the funding experience from their side, which I thought was really interesting because they had, I'll share it in the chat. I think it was something on the order of 3 weeks from the time that they applied to the time that they had money in the bank, maybe 4 weeks. So it was very quick. They were able to get to work super quickly. Data came out relatively fast. And now the subsequent IPT creation, this further fundraise also happened over an order of weeks. We got, I think, roughly 70 new people involved in the research project. And then that kind of brings up the question, some of those people are not super active. Other ones have a very direct interest in helping the project. And this is great. Having new people that are interested is great. But you can also imagine that there's coordination challenges that come with this as well, right? So you have all of a sudden a really interested community. You also have a researcher that you don't want to overwhelm and who you probably don't want to be bombarded by 70 random people with new questions all the time. So it's also a big challenge for us to understand how does one create the most effective structure possible to give maximum leverage to the researcher, maximum transparency, maximum ability to collaborate, but also filtering out what is bound to be quite a lot of noise in that process as well. And also not making the researcher feel that he's necessarily beholden to this community, but rather collaborating with them. And what we found was, basically in the initial, so when this tokenization event happens, we create, in essence, you could think of it like a constitution, a governance constitution that outlines kind of the law of the land or the rules for how the project will proceed, how bounties will be created. There's a project lead who's ultimately responsible for the project. And then the community votes on this. And then there's kind of this progressive governance that happens that I would say is happening in parallel with obviously the advancing of the research project. But so you create some methods of filtering high quality, high signal information and filtering out noise or low signal information. This is something that we're really learning by doing everything that we're doing, I would say, from the creation of these organizations to the tokenization of intellectual property to understanding how these communities form and work and get better at working, is an active, ongoing experiment. That's how I've always viewed everything that we do in the space. It's also why I've been interested in kind of Web3, because there's very few environments where you could create where you have a sandbox to really play with incentives in healthcare and drug development. So, I am curious, what would it look like to bring together 10 different neuroscientists around the world to collaborate on a project? How would that function? How would they work? How do we improve the way they work? All of these things are kind of iterative experiments with a huge number of challenges. DAOs, for everything that they gain in network effects and the ability to bring in crowd intelligence, they also suffer from coordination challenges, which is like, if you have 10,000, there's more than 10,000 people in BetaDAO. How do you actively manage 10,000 people and get the most out of them from a contribution perspective? And kind of what I've learned as for me, I would say over the past year, what I've learned is to really be hyper-conscious about what areas you decentralize and you kind of treat in this context of this new paradigm, and where otherwise you lean into all the wisdom that comes from centuries of centralized organizations, from best practices in startups, best practices in corporations, best practices in foundations. I think this has been a key learning, because when you're kind of innovating in a new area, it's very seductive to think that you can improve everything and you can stack innovation on top of innovation. But in fact, there are some things that kind of years of corporate evolution have gotten to a point where it makes sense to not necessarily innovate on them. But yeah, one thing I will say is that people like, the most fascinating thing for me is that people like Korolchuk and Matt Abbott's at the Newcastle TTO kind of looked onto this whole experience as like, we're grateful for the opportunity to like go on this journey with you and see what happens. And that appetite for innovation, that real appetite for innovation, where it's actually TTO, the job of the TTO in my mind is to help really translate innovation to the public. And that said, the appetite to do that is wildly different almost at every TTO. I think you have some folks that see things as like, kind of deviating from the status quo, which in my mind is intrinsic to the nature of innovation, is seen as very dangerous. And others who I think are like, if this serves the researcher, if this serves the PI, let's give it a try. And we've been totally dependent on those in that kind of latter category to be able to make advances.
For engaging with these TTOs, what sort of obstacles have you seen? Here at the Champlain, we're actually in the process of rethinking how we're going to be doing innovation. This is actually something I'm responsible for. So I want to learn some best practices, work practices, what works well with these new types of structures. And so, yeah, can you tell me some resistance you've been met with? Also, I'm sure there's a lot of doubt around Web3. Is this legit? How are we going to actually be able to access the funds when they come to light? All these questions around like, just even what is an IP-NFT? I'm sure they have a ton.
Yeah, so I would say the first mistake that we made, and I would basically define everything we've done, because we're building in this kind of like, it's like creating a new market, creating a new asset class. Everything's a bit unprecedented. There's no rule book, which provides a ton of unique challenges, but also kind of interesting learnings as well. I would say like we've just learned through mistakes pretty much exclusively. So it's like the first mistakes we made were approaching TTOs and universities from like a technology first standpoint, meaning like we were talking about like, this is blockchain, this is crypto, this is IP-NFTs. It actually doesn't make any sense to do this because you're just getting like red flags popping up all over the place. Instead, I think you need to learn to like speak their language, which is, we want to fund this research project through a sponsored research agreement. This is how we want these kind of sub-licensing to look like. This is how we're bringing together, we're building communities. We might not even talk about DAOs, but rather communities of patients, researchers that collaborate on drug development. So just really learning how to like abstract all the technical bits into the back end and think about them more as like a tool in the toolkit, right? That enables a certain outcome that we all collectively want. I think the next thing has been to realize that like universities feel very comfortable using their own agreements, their own frameworks. So when you try to impose external things, you just create friction. Rather, if you can figure out a way to like integrate their frameworks in the way that they already work, you're doing yourself a huge favor. The next thing has been really, really leaning into the TTOs who, I would say there's like a couple of different flavors of TTOs. And the one archetype that we've historically found easiest to work with, and also that I just philosophically think is best positioned to actually translate innovation, are those who just see it as their mission to serve the PI. And so the way we've always engaged was, we develop interest in a researcher that has a piece of research that we believe in from a commercial perspective. And then they're the person who's been the ally in the room with the TTO. It's possible, albeit more difficult, to approach TTOs cold. This is something that we're beginning to do now, as I think that like some elements of the model have been de-risked. Like Pfizer recently invested in BioDAOs, so there's obviously interest from large pharmaceutical companies. That obviously helps get a foot in the door, but it took definitely some super brave souls in the beginning to actually go for this and not think that we were completely crazy. Because when you start telling people that you're going to put a patent on the blockchain and give ownership to 10,000 different people, there's so many obvious questions that one would have where it seems like, I think if I was in that position, I would also be like, cool, come back in 2 or 3 years once you've proven it with somebody. So I think what we've learned now is, we have folks that are, used to be in TTOs themselves who understand. And by the way, when I say TTO, I'm not sure if this is a terminology that's used all over the world, be TLO as well, or just technology transfer, technology licensing offices at universities, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. But yeah, I think it's really just trying to find folks that have a particular appetite for innovation. And what I would say is, at a high level, there are a few hotspots globally: Harvard, MIT, Oxford, Cambridge, Stanford, Spark, these kind of innovation hubs that really dominate in terms of university technology transfer and licensing, and who are really doing innovative things. They probably, are less in need of something radically innovative than your kind of, still very good university, but maybe a university that's sitting in the middle of the US, or, and maybe away from a huge amount of biotech innovation. And the thing that we found is that, organizations that have really top researchers, but maybe don't have the type of intrinsic VC biotech spinout network as a San Francisco or something, are those that tend to be more open to kind of radical innovation. But yeah, from first principles, the way that we think about approaching these TTOs is really understanding how they currently work, understanding how we can plug into the ways that they currently work without having to force them to adopt new behaviors, and then really making sure that we're both operating in a way that is just serving the PI. And if we're aligned on those things, it's actually very easy to work together.
And what stage is typically the project at when either the PI finds you or finds a BioDAO, or when the BioDAO finds that PI? Because you did mention that it has to be commercialized, but it has to be just enough along. This is a very difficult kind of early stage space.
It's actually a super tight niche, the way I would describe it. And the way I think about this niche is the absolute perfect project for us is a project that is 2-3 killer experiments away from being able to be spun out into a biotech where there'd be some level of conviction and maybe 250 to 500K in funding to really prove a strong thesis, or kill the project and say that this isn't going to be commercially viable. This is a niche that I believe is more common than people think. I think, and often the researcher doesn't necessarily see it, but somebody who is an entrepreneur, or somebody who has built biotech companies, or somebody who has gone through the kind of drug development process, the preclinical stages, is able to see this in a way that the researcher might not be. So you might be, some medicinal chemistry and, a toxicology assay away from, having a potential de-risk therapeutic, and we want to be the source of capital for those things. The idea here is to really get in early, where there's a lot of potential upside for the community. And it's important to understand that the model of these DAOs, the way they work, is that basically it's like an endowment, no pun intended, but they fund commercializable research. And there's many different ways that they can exit that, either through licensing opportunities in the early stages, either by seeing it through the process, by partnering, by actually doing further tokenization events. But any capital that is generated in the commercialization process just goes back into the DAO treasury to fund further research. So it's kind of like closed loop economy. And this is quite powerful because it really orchestrates the community around trying to find cures. People aren't necessarily, it's still a for-profit venture, but all of those profits are reinvested into R&D. And we believe that that's something that's incredibly powerful and quite different to how the pharmaceutical industry works to a large extent. Like one thing that we've seen change over the past 20 years in pharma is that you used to have an industry that was really vertically integrated, like top to bottom, meaning that it's in-house R&D all the way through to market. And now what you see is that it's just much more economically sustainable for pharmaceutical companies to outsource their early stage innovation once it's already been kind of de-risked either by universities in the earliest stages or biotech in the kind of later stages. Today, more than half of the best-selling drugs on the market originated in academic labs, but I would say that we don't actually have the infrastructure, the people, and the networks to identify all of that promising innovation that lives scattered across the world, right? And so what I think of, the things that I think about when I think about what we're building are really like the kind of mycelial network that exists all over the world to identify that innovation and really help it kind of bridge that valley of death translational gap to get to a point where it is kind of eminently fundable. But that phase between like, this isn't basic research anymore. I think I'm maybe developing a therapeutic. We've done a screen, I've identified a molecule. It looks particularly promising, but it's still probably too early to actually spin this out into something is the kind of niche that we're operating in.
So you've spoken about really like traditional pharmaceutical drug development, so a molecule. And what we're doing at the Champollion is we're going to be starting to creating a digital therapeutics center here. So leveraging the neuroscience department and doing more digital therapeutics. Do you have any BioDAOs that are looking at digital as opposed to traditional pharmaceuticals?
It's interesting. It's such a ripe space, I think, for BioDAOs. And I think anything that's natively digital would absolutely make sense for these communities to work on, also because collaboration around these things and their development can be natively digital as well. There's nothing yet that exists in the space, and I wouldn't take that as an indication of anything other than how early the space itself is. I think, BioDAO has done some early investments, I believe, I could be wrong here, in some diagnostic technologies, things like aging clocks, which have a digital component. They've also supported this health app called Humana. So it's a bit of a digital health technology, but it's a small, very, very small percentage of the investments that it's made and the support that it's made. I would love to see something like this built. And for what it's worth, if there's anyone listening in on this call that's interested in building something like this, we also give $100,000 grants for those that are like starting organizations to develop these kinds of things. So yeah, nothing yet, but I think an area that would be really interesting to see development in.
Cool. I was like, okay, so market opportunity. You guys need a digital therapeutics DAO. We have 19 people on the call, so we already can get started. So I guess more of like a controversial question. Like, obviously, we think the crypto bubble has popped. There was a ton of funding flowing into a lot of crypto initiatives, Web3 initiatives back in 2019, 2020. How have you been affected by that directly? How are you kind of turning away the naysayers? And how does like the future look for Molecule?
Crypto's dead. Our funding is gone. Party's over. No, like, I mean, it's interesting. So, I mean, what tends to happen if you look at the history of like innovation and technology development is you tend to have these periods of like massively, like, I would say, hype bubbles that create the early internet was a great example. I wouldn't say like the early internet was overhyped in terms of like the impact of the internet is like probably the most profound thing that any of us have ever lived through. But there was a period of time where, every company had .com in the name, and we kind of know the story of how that investment bubble burst. And Web3 and crypto is no different, other than I would say that because of the lack of regulation in the space, it has been a hotbed for a lot of things that have really deteriorated trust largely in the space. But like any new technology, I think it can be used for good. It can also be used for things that are questionable. And contrary to what maybe a lot of people believe, there's still you know, hundreds of billions of dry powder in Web3 investments that's being invested, there's still people who have a long-term thesis, from your kind of mega funds like A16Z all the way through to your kind of small boutique firms. And I would say that you have people who are still looking at the space, trying to understand, you know, where fundamentals are being created. And we see DeSci, you know, as a new space that has the potential to be larger than, you know, the entirety of crypto by market cap right now, purely from the perspective that it's genuinely a novel use case that kind of moves outside of the speculative investment cryptocurrency use case into this kind of digital democracy realm. I think we were, you know, the whole space has been absolutely set back by things like FTX, by some of the other three hours capital, you know, the kind of just reckless behavior that has pervaded it. But I have a strong long-term thesis on the technology, which I think is something that is pretty much unstoppable and transcends any of these kind of transgressions that were actually a function of like centralized actors in the space and a few people having a lot of power. So Bitcoin remains to be an extremely strong store of value, and a way that a lot of people in the world are able to transfer money to each other, especially in areas that don't have the type of financial infrastructure that we have. Ethereum continues to be, you know, a profound technology for building networks on, and for doing many different types of, you know, there's many software applications built on it today. I think the future for the space, in terms of, you know, when you think about a blockchain, it's really the ideal type of technology for like something like a patent system, or something like an intellectual property system. It's an immutable, basically ledger or database, time-stamped, containing every single transaction that has ever been hashed in that ledger. And so it has this kind of, I think, the property, all the intrinsic properties of what a kind of globalized patent system would need to look like, or a global intellectual property system. I think we will see, you know, if you've been in Web3 for more than a couple of years, you've kind of seen and heard this story like probably 5 or 6 times by now. I've been tinkering in the space since 2013. And I think everybody who's been through like one or two of these kind of like market cycles understands that it's just this kind of recursive up and down thing that happens. That said, you know, I think what we're seeing is quite healthy. Like the space was overhyped. NFTs are not the future of everything. Not everything needs to be tokenized. And I think, you know, the future that I think about when I think if I really try to put my thinking hat on and understanding, like, what does science and funding science look like in 5 years or in 10 years? I think about systems that are, you know, probably driven significantly by decision-making that is assisted by AI, probably on cryptographic rails, and where you have communities of people around the world interacting in a digitally native way, whether that's crypto or something else, to basically collaborate, to fund things, to distribute money, knowledge, resources. And this is just the underlying technology infrastructure that is one means of supporting that future. I think increasingly so much science is going to be done in a digitally native way. Obviously, there's still a huge in medicine. You know, it's difficult because I think most of our data is directionally incorrect, meaning that like there's so much of science that is not reproducible, and so it's very hard to like train foundational models on bad data. But there's still so much that we do know, and I think as we get better and better at almost simulating biology from scratch with the kind of scale of compute that we have now, increasingly so much of what we do will be done in kind of digitally native simulations. And I would imagine the incentive structures for that should be natively digital as well. And that's kind of how I think about what we're doing.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of initiatives right now around patient-owned data that's leveraging Web3 and leveraging the blockchain for this, for security purposes. I've seen some successful projects come out of that. So I agree with you. I think there's a lot of potential there and ways to, it's not just incentivize, but also raise funds. So we're about 10 minutes out. I want to give you one more question and then pass it over to the audience for questions for you. And so if somebody in this room wanted to get their project funded, what's their first step Who do they look to? How can they find the DAO that's best for them?
So you could go to molecule.to, create a project page. DAOs are looking at opportunities on there, for example, as a first port of call if you want to have like broad reach to many different DAOs. If you work in a particular area that is like, let's say if you're working in longevity or women's reproductive health or psychedelics for mental health, there are, you could just search, for example, on bio.xyz for the different communities that exist right now to fund a project. If you're working in a space that, one of these communities has not been created in yet, you have a couple of options. One is waiting a bit of time for the next cohort, or two, BioDAOs, of which we're actually branching into quite a few different therapeutic areas. This will happen over the next 6 to 12 months. Or two, if you're feeling bold and want to build a community yourself, we have a program called BioXYZ, which is giving grants to actually help you start one of these organizations. Doesn't necessarily need to be a full-time gig, but if you want to actually create one of these kind of DAOs in a particular area to fund in a particular therapeutic area niche, we would be super happy to help anyone do that. I think the best place to get a sense of how the process works is either on BioXYZ Molecule or BetaDAO if you want to see a kind of like very specific example, but you typically submit an application, very quickly get a response from the community. They host a community call, they interview you, ask some questions, and you can go from having an idea, an application submitted, and to be being funded in as quickly as 4 weeks. Sometimes it takes a bit longer, so I'm definitely not going to promise anything, but we're trying to make it faster and faster all the time.
Yeah, also depending on the stage of the project, you mentioned there's some incubation that can be involved, or you can leverage that
exactly.
community. So with that, I want to open it up to the room. If anyone has questions for Tyler, you can, I think, just unmute and go for it, or raise your hand. We could do it in that way as well.
I'm here with John, Nina. I think John has a question, as always.
Hi, Nina, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, we heard a lot of sophisticated multiplex stuff about, we've heard this before, democratization, decentralization, and I found it kind of interesting that, the NFT market has crashed. We've had one transgression after another. Ethereum was funded initially by Peter Thiel, the most undemocratic person you could possibly imagine. He's in fact stated that he doesn't think that there's a compatibility between democracy and freedom. I'm actually going to Dialogue Global later this week, which he started to sort of, be with the enemy. We know now from crypto that you need to have intermediate bodies. The whales have undue influence. Somebody has to manage the wallet. So in other words, why isn't this in the end old wine in new bottles to make a small number of people rich, like we've always had? I just don't buy any of this. Can we have one concrete example where this has genuinely been democratic and people with elites who have been promised to get in on the first floor actually made any money? I mean, sometimes the disease is proof of the unhealth of the system.
Yeah, it's a nice viewpoint. For what it's worth, Peter Thiel sold all of his Ethereum and all of his crypto and kind of exited at the top. So he's obviously not a long-term believer in the space. But I think, and he also wasn't one of the major funders of Ethereum. I mean, Ethereum was, and the crowd sale, there was thousands of people that participated. But I think BetaDAO is actually quite a good example of this. There's more than 10,000 token or 10,000 folks that are involved in the community today. There still are some large token holders. For example, my organization is one of them. But for the most part, it is a decentralized community that is distributed quite wide. I think with any of these things, human behavior plays out the way that one would expect human behavior to play out in any realm. And progress is something that the threat of progress is typically slow. And what I believe is that technologies, for the most part, can be utilized in ways that improve human experience, the funding experience, translational drug development. And if you look at the market structure that exists today around bringing new therapeutics to market, there was a paper in 2018 that was titled, "Is Curing Disease a Sustainable Business Model?" published by a Goldman Sachs analyst that looked at the case of Gilead creating a hepatitis C drug and the fact that they were basically punished by the market credit rating downgraded because they actually developed a cure for a disease and were, basically killed one of the most valuable drugs in the portfolio. Crypto is a technology that we use in the back end. We're not using it to make people rich. We're using it as a kind of, I would say, adjacent way, which is really related to actually just enabling people to vote in a verifiable way on the internet. That is the primary use case that we're enabling. And the tokenization of intellectual property, as we deal with it, is just another way to enable somebody to transfer ownership or fractional ownership in a piece of IP. I don't see what we're doing as creating new cryptocurrencies. We're creating governance tokens for these organizations that allow patient communities to interact. And not everyone's going to be a believer, and I don't think they should be. I think being super skeptical about this space is directionally the right thing to do. I also maintain my own skepticism, but I think that if you woke up every day and looked at the world and your attitude was, it's always just different wine in a new cat, or the same wine in a new cask, and there's no hope, no reason to innovate, I think would be a kind of sad way to live. So I'm very, very optimistic that there will be beneficial use cases of these technologies. And just to point out a couple, because you mentioned Ethereum, Gitcoin is a perfect example of a protocol that's a public good that has distributed millions of dollars to folks all over the world with an interest in helping people get projects off the ground. Protocol Labs has been completely leading a bunch of philanthropic efforts through events like Funding the Commons to help fund folks. Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, has donated billions of dollars, but over $1 billion to crypto, things like COVID relief in India, things like longevity itself, things like funding in the sciences. And there's an entire field within Web3 related to public goods funding that has donated collectively tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars to initiatives to advance the sciences. And some of the largest whales, if we call them that, in crypto, have also funded many organizations, many scientific organizations, like Arcadia Sciences, et cetera, that are really focused on actually advancing the cutting edge of the science. So while I totally share your skepticism about the majority of folks in the space and the culture of grifting and the fact that there's a lot of people always looking for opportunities to leverage to get rich, I think they're finding those opportunities not only in Web3, but in every space they touch, and will probably continue to act in a way that is, parasitic, whether it's in traditional capital markets, equity markets, crypto, and that's just, the threat of human behavior, which I think plays out everywhere. I think it's a good point to say that, it is questionable if crypto is, the future of democracy. I would say probably not. But I think digital democracy, so having some sort of system in which many people around the world are able to interact, vote, have a say in certain things, will certainly be necessary in the future. And currently, I have not seen a better architecture to do that beyond decentralized systems. And what I mean by that is that if you want to create a system where folks can have a say that doesn't require the trust of a central player, you'd be hard-pressed to find a better thing than crypto. And all the major shortcomings in the space, Sam Bankman-Fried, FTX, these were actually all centralized plays by centralized companies. They weren't blockchains. They were literally centralized exchanges. So yeah, I have a different thesis to you, but totally respect your viewpoint. And I wouldn't expect much different, just given how bad I think the reputation of the space is. And it's for what it's worth, I think rightfully so.
Thank you very much. Great answer.
Do we have any other questions for Tyler?
I have a more general question, which is, so it seems like behind all of this is a belief that there are unmet needs, that there are lots of people out there that if you were to tap into the community more broadly, would want, research dollars being directed in different ways. One of the reasons for that, I see there's sort of two, amongst those people, two classes. One is people who say are affected by some disease or have an interest in some disease that maybe is a rare disease. So there's not the same, there's not a financial incentive for the kind of big, you know, pharma companies to kind of take those on. Another group might be people who feel that there's sort of light under the lamppost work going on within the traditional system and are looking for alternative kind of approaches to what are, you know, not rare diseases. So in the former case, it seems like you're always going to run up against like drug development costs if you're talking about drugs. And so how do you get around that? How does this help in any way that problem? And then the second one is it a goal to try and use the kind of democratization of funding to basically demonstrate that off the beaten path approaches are viable to the traditional, say, pharma industry?
Great question. A couple of things. So going back to the first point, I think with respect to rare disease and many of the things of which I think the point that you're making is that at the end of the day, you still need to come up with the capital to develop a drug, and that, you know, if the incentive does not exist for one of the kind of incumbent stakeholders to do that, even though they'll probably be necessary in this process, why do we think that this would necessarily make that process easier? It's a great question. I would say that there's a few concrete use cases that I would point to that have inspired a lot of confidence in me that there are much cheaper ways to develop drugs than we've typically done. And I would also say that this is part of our thesis around not only DAOs being, you know, effective capital allocators for areas that have typically been underallocated to, but also potentially advantageous from a cost perspective. And the one I would point you in the direction of, maybe some people here are familiar with it, is called Open Source Pharma, which is an initiative by J. Kumar Menon, who's a human rights lawyer out of Harvard, that then basically started an initiative where people around the world were contributing data to a GitHub repository, typically around initiatives to develop therapeutics for tropical diseases. So there's one for malaria that is quite prominent. And recently, his group has managed to bring a drug to phase 3, I think for less than $1 million, which actually sounds completely outlandish when you say it like this, but it's worth understanding they're operating in the context of the Indian system. They're operating a little bit more they're thinking like generic manufacturers or generic producers in some sense, and they're also having the kind of good fortune of working with like the World Health Organization and some other regulators who are helping advance this. But they basically managed to tap into, I think, a network of scientists around the world who basically really are thinking through, is there a way to do drug development fully open source? This runs actually kind of counter to the intellectual property system that we're creating in some ways, where we believe that there still needs to be a strong commercial incentive, like a financial incentive in some ways to do these developments. But for me, it has been, I can't say proof, but at least anecdotal evidence that it is possible to develop drugs for cheaper than the kind of numbers that were quoted. And I think a lot of people think, you know, there was a kind of landmark Tufts study in 2013 that quoted the price to be around like $2.8 billion to develop a drug. This incorporates a huge amount of, you know, failure costs as well. You typically see successful drug development happening, I think, anywhere from the lowest end being like $50 million to the highest end being, you know, over $1 billion. What I kind of believe and is basically that not for all rare diseases, and you know, there's probably a certain N of patients where this becomes viable, where you've typically had organizations, patient advocacy organizations, that were funding biotech companies almost as if it was philanthropic funding. So meaning that you have organizations, they raise a lot of money collectively from patients, from wealthy donors. In some cases, they donate that money or give that money with some strings attached to a biotech company. And we believe that there's basically like one step better in that process, where basically these communities can have some governance and ownership over the things that they're funding. So it's basically like trying to take that more nonprofit oriented, let's say, rare disease funding infrastructure, foundations, et cetera, and rather than having them operate through philanthropy, and some have already done this successfully without Web3, having them operate almost more like public trust biotech companies or something like this. I'm not sure if that will work in all cases. I think it remains to be seen, but what I do believe is that there is a huge strength in bringing together the world's patient populations and the world's researchers in a structure where they're speaking to each other directly, pooling research directly. Many patient advocates, children, parents of children with rare diseases are amongst the best informed people in a particular space, and I'm absolutely sure that one way or another, there's a huge benefit in more actively mining that insight and tapping into the resources. To the other thing that you mentioned, which is those that are just frustrated in the current system and want a different way of doing things because they might not believe in or maybe are just frustrated. Everyone here probably realizes that there's a mass exodus happening in academia. There's a lot of people who are frustrated with the status quo. There's a lot of people who live outside of areas where it is easy to get VC funding, and we believe there's something here for them as well. But we're very early in this process with a lot to learn. We're just kind of riding off of this idea that the thesis that we have is that there's intelligence in the crowd, there's capital in the crowd, there's talent acquisition resources in the crowd, and that having people working in the kind of base level thesis is that having people working in a more transparent, collaborative way with the right incentive layer on the top of that will create better outcomes. Whether what OSP is doing is truly scalable remains to be seen. They are working in a niche, but for anyone who hasn't seen it, please do check out J. Kumar Menon's work. He's, in my opinion, one of the most brilliant people innovating in the kind of drug development landscape, and I think is kind of living proof that there is a cheaper and more efficient way of doing things. Sorry, I realized I'm not sure if that totally answered your question. I'm not sure if I have a better answer for your question, in that I think it remains to be seen if we'll be able to do what you're asking, but we'll certainly try.
I think if we have maybe one more question, and then we should wrap it up. And all right, Nuno, you want to go ahead?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thanks. Tyler, thank you so much for your talk. It was really amazing. I've been with this crypto space for the last 3 years. I always wondered why doesn't anyone work with science, because they're a perfect match. Now I found out. And so I have a few questions. I have many questions, so I'll choose just one. And one is, you touched a little bit on that, the DAOs. So I think one of creating DAOs in the crypto space is ideal. But I think it's been very difficult lately, I think, probably mostly because you need a critical number of people to make it work, because it's still centralized, you have just 10 people, right? But even if you get that high number of people, it's not very difficult, for example, for a big pharma company to take over the project, I think. So do you have, I know there are usually some processes in the way to avoid this to happen, keep it decentralized, or is it very difficult to do?
I think it's quite easy to do. So all of these questions are questions around token economics or tokenomics, which is kind of the field of incentive engineering in crypto. And the way that we've typically done it is that you typically have some number of people. We would define a critical mass for an initial community as somewhere in the range of 20 to 50 people coming together. Obviously still very small and very centralized, but decentralization is always something that happens progressively. And so the way that we've typically thought about it is that a community that actually controls the majority of tokens does not mint everything from the get-go, but basically mints small amounts and sells it over time, ideally to not whales. So you don't have let's say a single whale holding 10% of the tokens, but you might have an initial auction where the minimum way for the auction to clear is if there's 1,000 participants, for example. And so at that point, you now have 1,000 people that control the entire token supply and have the ability to mint and sell more tokens. So let's say 10% of the tokens have been issued, 1,000 people now hold those tokens, and with those tokens, they govern the remaining 90%. And now through governance, if a pharmaceutical company wanted to take over, the only way they could do so is by buying those tokens individually from those 1,000 people. Possible, probably, difficult to do. Or by the DAO minting a bunch of tokens and putting them for sale in the market at once, which is not advisable ever, in my opinion. The way that we typically do it is we always advise our DAOs to fundraise in tranches by selling like 10% of the token supply at the time, and always being conscious that in the worst case scenario, if an adversarial actor bought the entire 10%, that there would be enough tokens outstanding distributed otherwise to prevent what is called like a hostile governance takeover. These are all like, I think, slightly more nuanced technical and governance and token economic questions, but there is a field, like an entire field with a lot of research, like active research, game theoretics, economics, where people are looking at these systems and basically how to deploy them in ways that are prevent against things like hostile governance takeovers. But you're absolutely right. It's something that you could very easily create a DAO that is not thinking through any of this and be subject to these type of hostile takeovers relatively easily. And this is also why, for those of you that have been in crypto for a while or who have followed, I mean, there was the first DAO ever basically imploded catastrophically through like a hostile governance takeover through a hack. And that is actually why I think DAOs more or less died from like 2016 to 2019, maybe 2018, just because the first one was checkered by so much failure. And that obviously, like, it's a nice idea to have everything done through code, but it obviously also offers you to vulnerabilities that are intrinsic to having structures that are fully operated through code.
Thank you.
All right, I'll leave that as the last question. Thank you so much, Tyler, for sharing some of your time with us today and for educating us about DeSci and IP-NFTs and everything in between. If anyone has any follow-up questions, do you want them to reach out to you, or how could somebody get in touch? What would you
Totally. I mean, I feel free to reach out to me directly. I would be more than happy to talk with anyone on this call, skeptic or otherwise. I also really like understanding where people are coming from in the space. Like the kind of critical question that was asked earlier, I think is such a good point. Like it had a lot of great points and is actually representative, I think, of a lot of the things that we need to be aware of as we build this space around, how people think about it. And for us, feedback, thoughts, ideas, anything that you want to come with, I would be an honor to talk. We also, for those that are interested in getting into a slightly messier world of DeSci, I would also invite you to our DeSci server, which is a Discord server rather. It's a place where if you're interested in chatting with us, the team, other people building in the space, you can actually kind of hop on and just get chatting with people. These communities typically have hundreds or thousands of people in them. And I think it would enable you to get a sense of like how things work in a kind of much more firsthand way. Maybe Nina, if you have time, you could distribute like links to the various Discord servers after this, because I'm trying to pull them off quickly, but it's
I'll do it because there's quite a few. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, and then if anyone has a project, reach out to me directly. We're always looking for things to fund. If anyone's interested in learning more about how to build, reach out directly. It would be an honor to chat to anyone a bit more about this stuff. And thanks so much for giving us a platform to discuss this, Nina. I really appreciate it and wish you a ton of luck with this as a platform in general. Really, really nice, really, really thoughtful questions.
Cool. Thanks so much, Tyler. And yeah, so that's it, everyone.
Cool.
Cool.
Ciao.
Ciao.